In the heart of a dense, ancient forest where sunlight barely pierced through the thick canopy above, there lived a being unlike any other. She was not human, though she bore some resemblance. A delicate frame, eyes that shimmered like starlight, and hair that cascaded down her back in waves as dark as midnight. But her essence was something else entirely. Her kind had existed long before humans walked upright on two legs, their presence an echo of forgotten times when magic still coursed freely through the veins of the earth. She despised them, humans. Their greed knew no bounds. They devoured everything in their path, leaving scars upon the land that even time struggled to heal. They felled trees without thought for the creatures who called those branches home, polluted rivers until fish floated belly up, and poisoned the air with smoke from machines that roared louder than thunderstorms. To her, they were vermin, unworthy of the beauty they so carelessly destroyed. Every tale she heard of their wars, their cruelty, only deepened her disdain. And yet, despite this hatred, or perhaps because of it, she found herself drawn to observe them from afar, hidden among shadows or perched high atop rocky cliffs overlooking their villages. Her name carried whispers of power, though few dared speak it aloud, Nyxera. It meant shadow weaver in the tongue of her people, though none remained now but her. Once, her kin had thrived alongside nature, guardians of balance and harmony. Now she stood alone, a relic of what once was, watching as humanity's dominion spread like wildfire across the world. The solitude weighed heavily on her shoulders, but she bore it with quiet resolve, believing herself superior to the chaos wrought by mankind. Yet beneath her disdain lay a flicker of curiosity, a question she refused to acknowledge but could not fully extinguish. Why did they persist? What drove these fragile creatures to conquer and create, destroy and rebuild? It was during one such observation that her world shifted irrevocably. She had chosen a vantage point near the edge of the forest, where tall grass swayed gently under the golden light of dusk. Below her stretched a narrow dirt path winding its way toward a small village nestled between rolling hills. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, mingling with the scent of freshly baked bread wafting through the crisp evening air. Children laughed somewhere in the distance, their voices carrying a melody both foreign and strangely compelling. Nyxera crouched low, her form blending seamlessly with the shadows cast by towering oaks. She watched, as she often did, waiting for nothing in particular, just another moment stolen from the lives of those she loathed. And then he appeared. At first, he seemed unremarkable, just another figure trudging along the worn trail. His clothes were simple, patched here and there but clean, and his boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each step. He carried a satchel slung over one shoulder, its contents shifting slightly with his movements. His face was partially obscured by the brim of a wide hat, shielding him from the last rays of sunlight filtering through the trees. Something about him caught her attention, though she couldn't immediately place why. Perhaps it was the deliberate steadiness of his pace, unhurried yet purposeful, or the way he paused occasionally to glance at the sky, as if searching for answers written in the fading colors of twilight. But when he finally lifted his head and removed his hat, revealing sharp features softened by a faint smile, her breath hitched involuntarily. His eyes, those piercing storm-gray eyes, locked onto hers for the briefest of moments, though surely he couldn't see her concealed within the gloom. Still, the connection felt undeniable, electric, sending a jolt racing through her chest. For the first time in centuries, maybe longer, she felt unsettled, vulnerable, as if the wall she had built around herself, brick by painstaking brick, had begun to crumble under the weight of a single glance. Nyxera recoiled instinctively, retreating deeper into the foliage, her heart pounding wildly against her ribcage. What was this? This inexplicable reaction? She hated humans, all of them, and yet here she was, trembling like a frightened animal because one had looked at her. No, not just looked. Seen her. Or at least, she feared he might have. The thought sent tendrils of unease coiling through her mind, wrapping tightly around her thoughts until all she could focus on was the man walking away, oblivious to the turmoil he had left in his wake. 4 days after that encounter, Nyxera tried to convince herself it meant nothing. A fleeting moment, a trick of the light, a misinterpretation of her own emotions. But no matter how hard she pushed the memory aside, it lingered, stubborn and unyielding, refusing to be dismissed. Each night, as she wandered the forest under the watchful gaze of the moon, fragments of his image haunted her thoughts. His steady stride, The curve of his lips when he smiled, the intensity of his eyes, it all replayed in her mind like a song she couldn't silence. And worse still, she found herself drawn back to the same spot where she'd seen him, hoping against hope that he might return. He didn't. Not right away. Days turned into weeks, and the ache inside her grew sharper, more insistent. It wasn't longing, she told herself fiercely. Longing implied affection, attachment, feeling she would never allow herself to feel for someone so inherently flawed. No, it was curiosity. Pure, simple curiosity. That had to be it. She needed to understand why he had affected her so profoundly, why her carefully constructed hatred faltered in his presence. Surely, there was some logical explanation, some flaw in her reasoning that could be corrected once she unraveled the mystery. Yet logic failed her. The more she dwelled on him, the less sense anything made. She hated humans. They were destructive, selfish, cruel. These truths were immutable, carved into the very fabric of her existence. So why, then, did her chest tighten every time she recalled the way his eyes had met hers? Why did her pulse quicken whenever she imagined hearing his voice, even though she had no idea what it sounded like? It was infuriating, maddening, and utterly beyond her control. One evening, unable to bear the restlessness any longer, she ventured closer to the village than she ever had before. The air smelled different here, tinged with wood smoke and spices, and the sounds were unfamiliar yet oddly comforting. The rhythmic clanging of metal against metal, the murmur of conversation drifting from open windows, the occasional bark of a dog echoing through the streets. She moved silently, unseen, slipping between shadows like smoke. Her senses were heightened, every nerve ending alive with anticipation. Somewhere in this labyrinth of human life, she hoped to find answers, or perhaps closure. Instead, she found him. He was sitting on a low stone wall at the edge of the village square, his hat resting beside him as he leaned forward, elbows propped on his knees. In his hands, he held a piece of parchment, studying it intently while absently chewing on the end of a quill. Around him, villagers bustled about their business, paying him little heed, but Nixera couldn't look away. There was something mesmerizing about the way he focused, completely absorbed in whatever task occupied his mind. His brow furrowed slightly, and he muttered under his breath, shaking his head before scribbling something down with swift, decisive strokes. She wanted to hate him. She should hate him. But standing there, watching him so absorbed in his work, she felt only confusion, and something softer, something dangerous. Before she realized what she was doing, she took a step closer, then another, until she was mere feet away, concealed behind the corner of a weathered barn. If anyone had been paying attention, they might have noticed the unnatural stillness of the air around her, the way the shadows seemed to pool unnaturally thick. But no one did. All eyes were elsewhere, leaving her free to observe undisturbed. And then, as if sensing her presence, he looked up. Their gazes collided once more, and this time, there was no mistaking it, he saw her. Not just the vague outline of movement or the suggestion of a figure lurking in the dark. He saw her. His expression shifted subtly, surprise giving way to something warmer, almost welcoming. He tilted his head slightly, as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing, and raised a hand in greeting. "Hello," he called softly, his voice carrying a richness that sent shivers down her spine. "Is someone there?" Panic surged through her, hot and sudden, and she retreated instantly, melting back into the forest before he could follow. Her heart raced, her thoughts a chaotic whirlwind. How had he seen her? Humans weren't supposed to notice her kind unless she allowed it, and she certainly hadn't intended to reveal herself. Yet somehow, he had pierced through her veil of invisibility, forcing her into the light whether she liked it or not. That night, as she sat alone beneath the stars, Nixera wrestled with emotions she didn't know how to name. Fear, yes, but also something else, something that burned brighter and hotter than anything she'd ever experienced. It terrified her, this newfound vulnerability, this crack in the armor she had worn for so long. And yet, even as she vowed never to return to the village, part of her already knew she would. Because despite everything, her hatred, her pride, her fear, she couldn't stay away. The pull was undeniable, stronger with each passing day. Though Nixera fought it with every fiber of her being, the memory of his voice calling out to her echoed endlessly in her mind, haunting her dreams and waking hours alike. She told herself it was foolishness, weakness, a lapse in judgment brought on by centuries of isolation. Yet the truth gnawed at her relentlessly. She wanted to see him again. Not merely to understand why he had shaken her so deeply, but because the thought of never seeing him again filled her with an emptiness she couldn't bear. So, under the cover of darkness, she returned to the village. This time, she approached with caution, cloaking herself in shadows thicker than before, ensuring that no prying eyes could detect her presence. The streets were quieter now, most of the villagers having retired to their homes for the night. Only a few lanterns flickered weakly, casting pools of amber light onto cobblestone paths. She moved silently, her footsteps swallowed by the soft earth, until she reached the edge of the square where she had last seen him. He wasn't there. Disappointment surged within her, sharp and unexpected. She scanned the area, her keen eyes catching every detail: the empty stone wall where he had sat, the scrap of parchment fluttering in the breeze near his abandoned hat. Her chest tightened, and she clenched her fists, frustrated with herself for feeling such loss over someone she barely knew. Turning to leave, she froze when a sound reached her ears, a faint hum, melodic and warm, drifting from somewhere nearby. Curiosity overruled caution, and she followed the sound, weaving through narrow alleys until she came upon a small cottage at the outskirts of the village. Light spilled from its windows, painting golden rectangles onto the ground outside. The humming grew louder, accompanied by the rhythmic scrape of wood against stone. Peering cautiously through the window, she saw him. He was seated at a rough-hewn table, bent over a piece of wood clutched firmly in his hands. A knife glinted in the candlelight as he carved intricate patterns into the surface, his movements precise and deliberate. Shavings fell to the floor around him, piling softly like snowflakes. His expression was one of quiet concentration, his lips moving slightly as if counting beats or reciting words only he could hear. On the table beside him lay several finished pieces, small figurines of animals, delicate and lifelike, each imbued with a craftsmanship that spoke of patience and care. Nyxera's breath caught. There was something achingly beautiful about the scene, something that stirred emotions she had long buried. She had always believed humans incapable of creating anything worthwhile, dismissing their art as crude imitations of nature's perfection. But this was different. Each stroke of his blade seemed to breathe life into the wood, transforming it into something new yet familiar. It reminded her of her own abilities, the way she wove shadows into tangible forms, shaping them with intention and will. For the first time, she saw a reflection of herself in a human, a shared spark of creativity, a desire to leave a mark on the world. As if sensing her gaze, he paused mid-stroke and glanced toward the window. She ducked instinctively, pressing herself flat against the wall, her heart hammering wildly. When she dared to peek again, he was staring directly at the spot where she had been, his brow furrowed in thought. Slowly, he set down his tools and rose from the table, crossing the room to stand before the door. Her instincts screamed at her to flee, to vanish into the night before he could catch her spying. But her feet refused to obey, rooted to the spot as if bound by invisible chains. The door creaked open, and he stepped outside, scanning the darkness with those piercing gray eyes. "I know you're out there," he said softly, his voice calm but firm. "You don't have to hide." Her throat went dry. Every instinct urged her to retreat, to disappear into the safety of the forest where she belonged. But something in his tone, a note of kindness, of genuine curiosity, held her captive. Against all reason, she stepped forward, emerging from the shadows into the pale glow of the lantern hanging above his door. His reaction was not what she expected. Instead of fear or hostility, his face lit up with a mixture of wonder and relief. "There you are," he murmured, taking a hesitant step closer. "I thought I imagined you the other night." She didn't respond, unsure of what to say, or whether she even could. Up close, he was even more striking, his features softened by the flickering light. His presence radiated warmth, a stark contrast to the cold detachment she had cultivated for so long. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the silence stretching taut between them. Finally, he broke it. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice gentle, almost reverent. Or perhaps, what are you? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Part of her wanted to lie, to fabricate some story that would satisfy his curiosity and send him on his way. But another part, a part she barely recognized, yearned to tell him the truth. To share the burden of her existence with someone who might, just might, understand. "I am Nixera," she whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Shadow Weaver." His eyes widened slightly, but he didn't recoil. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if piecing together a puzzle. "Nixera," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. "That's fitting. You move like the night itself." A strange warmth bloomed in her chest at his words, unfamiliar yet intoxicating. She had spent centuries hiding from humans, despising them, convinced they would destroy everything they touched. Yet here he was, regarding her with neither fear nor malice, but with a quiet admiration that left her breathless. "What is your name?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. She hadn't intended to engage him further, hadn't planned to give him any part of herself. But now that she had started, she couldn't seem to stop. "Elias," he replied, offering her a small, tentative smile. Just Elias. The simplicity of it struck her. No grand titles, no pretense, just a name, plain and honest. It suited him, she decided. There was a purity to him, a sincerity that defied everything she thought she knew about his kind. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, neither speaking, neither moving. The world seemed to shrink around them, narrowing to the space between his doorstep and the edge of the forest. Finally, he gestured toward the open door. "Would you like to come in?" he asked, his tone careful, as if afraid to frighten her away. "I won't hurt you. I promise." Every rational thought screamed at her to refuse, to retreat into the safety of the shadows where she belonged. But her heart, traitorous, rebellious thing that it was, had other plans. With a nod so slight it might have been imagined, she stepped across the threshold, leaving the night behind. Inside, the cottage was modest but inviting, its wooden beams worn smooth with age. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the walls. The air smelled of pine and earth, mingling with the faint aroma of herbs drying on a rack near the window. It was a humble space, far removed from the opulence she had once known among her own kind, yet it exuded a warmth that made her chest ache in ways she couldn't explain. Elias gestured for her to sit at the table, pulling out a chair before taking his own. For a moment, they simply regarded each other, the silence between them charged with unspoken questions. Then, with a sheepish grin, he reached for one of the figurines he had been carving earlier, a tiny fox, its tail curled delicately around its body. "Here," he said, holding it out to her. "A peace offering." She hesitated, her fingers brushing the smooth surface of the wood. It was exquisite, each detail rendered with painstaking precision. The fox seemed almost alive, poised to leap from her palm at any moment. "Why do you carve these?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "I suppose it's my way of making sense of the world. Of finding beauty in things that might otherwise go unnoticed." His gaze drifted to the window, where the first hints of dawn painted the horizon in shades of pink and gold. "When I was younger, I used to think the world was too big, too complicated to ever truly understand. But then I realized that sometimes the smallest things hold the greatest meaning. Like this fox. It's just a piece of wood, but it reminds me of the ones I've seen darting through the woods, wild and free." His words resonated with her in ways she couldn't articulate. She had spent centuries observing humanity from afar, cataloging their flaws and failures, convinced they were incapable of appreciating the world they inhabited. Yet here was Elias, crafting tributes to its wonders with his own hands, finding joy in the act of creation rather than destruction. It challenged everything she believed, forcing her to confront the possibility that perhaps not all humans were the same. "You're different," she said finally, her voice tinged with both awe and uncertainty. "From the others." He chuckled softly, running a hand through his tousled hair. "Maybe. Or maybe you just haven't met the right ones yet." His expression sobered, and he leaned forward, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "Tell me, Nixera, why do you hate us so much?" The question hit her like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. She hadn't expected him to ask so directly, to cut straight to the heart of her pain. For a moment, she considered deflecting, offering some vague platitude that would satisfy his curiosity without revealing too much. But looking into his earnest face, she found she couldn't lie. "I've seen what your kind does," she began, her voice trembling despite her efforts to steady it. "The forests razed to the ground, the rivers choked with filth, the skies darkened with smoke. You take and take, never stopping to consider what you leave behind. My people, they tried to protect this world, to keep it balanced. But you destroyed them, just as you destroy everything else." Her words hung heavy in the air, raw and unfiltered. She braced herself for his reaction, expecting anger or denial. Instead, he sighed deeply, his shoulders sagging as if bearing an invisible weight. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "We've done terrible things. Some of us still do. But not all of us are like that, Nixera. Some of us want to fix what's broken, to make amends for the mistakes of our ancestors." She studied him closely, searching for any trace of deceit or manipulation. But his expression remained open, his eyes filled with a sincerity that disarmed her. "Why should I believe you?" she challenged, her voice sharp with skepticism. "What makes you any different?" He didn't answer immediately, instead reaching for another piece of wood and beginning to carve. The rhythmic scrape of the blade against the surface filled the silence as he worked, his movements fluid and practiced. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, thoughtful. "Because I've seen the damage firsthand. My father was a hunter, one of the best in the region. He taught me how to track animals, how to read the signs of the forest. But he also showed me the consequences of taking too much. Whole groves stripped bare, streams dried up, creatures driven to extinction. By the time I was old enough to understand, I knew I couldn't follow in his footsteps. So I chose a different path, to create rather than consume, to honor the world instead of exploiting it." His confession unsettled her, stirring memories she had long suppressed. Images of her kin, their laughter echoing through ancient woods, their songs weaving spells that kept the land alive. She remembered the day the first humans arrived, their axes gleaming in the sunlight, their faces alight with greed. One by one, her people fell, their magic fading as the forests burned. By the time she fled, she was the last, a solitary shadow clinging to a dying world. Tears welled in her eyes, though she fought to hold them back. She hadn't cried in centuries, hadn't allowed herself the luxury of grief. But sitting there, listening to Elias speak of loss and redemption, she felt the dam inside her begin to crack. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why do you care what I think?" He set down his carving, reaching across the table to take her hand. His touch was warm, grounding, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't pull away. "Because I see something in you," he said, his voice soft but unwavering. "Something worth saving. And because I think we might have more in common than you realize." Her breath hitched, and she stared at him, searching for the lie she was certain must be lurking beneath his words. But all she found was truth, an unshakable conviction that made her heart race and her doubts falter. For the first time, she allowed herself to entertain the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't like the others. That maybe he could be trusted. As the days turned into weeks, Nixera found herself returning to Elias's cottage more frequently, drawn by a force she could neither deny nor fully comprehend. At first, their interactions were cautious, marked by long stretches of silence punctuated by halting conversations. She spoke sparingly, wary of revealing too much, while he listened intently, his gray eyes reflecting a patience that both unnerved and comforted her. Yet gradually, the barriers between them began to dissolve, replaced by a tentative camaraderie that neither had anticipated. Elias introduced her to the rhythms of his daily life, sharing meals cooked over the fire and teaching her the names of plants and animals she had long taken for granted. He showed her how to weave baskets from reeds gathered by the riverbank, his hands guiding hers with gentle precision. In turn, she revealed fragments of her own world, how to summon shadows into tangible shapes, how to listen for the whispers of the wind as it danced through the trees. Though she remained guarded, reluctant to expose the full extent of her powers, he accepted what she offered without judgment, his curiosity tempered by respect. Their bond deepened in ways neither could have foreseen. Late at night, as the embers of the fire glowed faintly in the hearth, they would sit side by side, talking about everything and nothing. Elias spoke of his childhood, of summers spent exploring the woods with his father and winters huddled indoors with books borrowed from traveling merchants. He confessed his dreams of one day leaving the village, of venturing beyond the hills to see the wider world. Nixera, in turn, shared stories of her people. Tales of festivals held beneath starlit skies, of rituals that bound them to the earth and sky. Though she omitted the darker chapters of her history, the pain of loss lingered in her voice, and Elias listened without interrupting, his presence a quiet anchor in the storm of her memories. Yet even as their connection grew, shadows loomed on the horizon. The villagers, though largely indifferent to Elias's solitary habits, began to notice subtle changes in the forest surrounding their homes. Trees that had once stood barren now sprouted leaves overnight, their branches heavy with fruit. Streams ran clearer, their waters teeming with fish that had vanished years ago. Whispers spread of strange occurrences, of deer appearing where none had been seen for decades, of birds singing melodies long forgotten. While some marveled at the renewal, others grew suspicious, their unease manifesting in muttered prayers and nervous glances toward the woods. Nixera sensed their unease, felt the weight of their suspicion pressing against her like a storm cloud ready to burst. She warned Elias, urging him to distance himself from her lest he become entangled in their suspicions. But he refused, his loyalty unwavering. "They'll come around," he insisted, though doubt flickered in his eyes. "Once they see the good you're doing, they'll understand." Her heart ached at his optimism, knowing full well that understanding was a rare commodity among humans. Still, she couldn't bring herself to sever the ties that bound them, even as the tension in the village grew palpable. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, a group of men approached, their faces grim and their torches casting harsh light across the yard. Elias rose to meet them, his posture tense but resolute, while Nixera melted into the shadows, her form dissolving into the encroaching darkness. The confrontation was brief but charged, the men accusing Elias of harboring unnatural forces, of consorting with spirits that threatened their way of life. He denied nothing, his defense calm but firm. "Whatever you think you've seen, it's not evil," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "If anything, it's given us back what we lost. Isn't that worth protecting?" The men exchanged uneasy glances, their resolve wavering but not breaking. They left with warnings, their torches casting long shadows that lingered long after they had gone. When Elias turned back to the house, Nixera emerged from the shadows, her expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have defended me," she said, her voice hollow. "They'll never accept me." "They don't have to," he replied, stepping closer until they were mere inches apart. "All that matters is that I do." His words struck her like a bolt of lightning, illuminating truths she had buried beneath layers of fear and mistrust. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she wasn't alone, where the line between her world and his blurred into something new and undefined. Yet even as hope blossomed within her, she knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. The villagers' suspicions were only the beginning, and the weight of her past loomed large, threatening to unravel the fragile trust she had begun to build. Still, as she stood there under the watchful gaze of the stars, her hand clasped tightly in Elias's, she dared to believe, for the first time in centuries, that perhaps love, in all its messy complexity, might be enough to bridge the chasm between them. The days that followed were a delicate dance, each moment teetering between hope and fear. Nixera remained hidden during the daylight hours, retreating deep into the forest where the villagers rarely ventured. But as twilight descended and the world was bathed in hues of indigo and silver, she would return to Elias's cottage, slipping through the shadows like a ghost. Their time together became both a sanctuary and a battlefield, a place where they could momentarily forget the growing tension outside, yet also where the weight of their reality pressed down upon them with increasing intensity. Elias tried to reassure her, his optimism unwavering even as the murmurs in the village grew louder. "They're just scared," he said one evening, his hands busy carving a new figurine, a bird this time, its wings spread wide as if caught mid-flight. "Fear makes people lash out. But once they see there's nothing to be afraid of, they'll calm down." Nixera wanted to believe him. Truly she did. But centuries of observing humanity had taught her that fear often bred hatred, and hatred rarely dissipated without consequence. She watched the villagers from afar, noting how their glances lingered longer on Elias now, how their conversations hushed when he passed by. Some still smiled at him, offering polite nods or brief words of greeting, But others avoided his gaze altogether, their faces etched with suspicion. It was only a matter of time before their unease boiled over into something far more dangerous. "You shouldn't stay here," she told him one night, her voice tight with frustration. They were sitting by the fire, the flames casting flickering light across their faces. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of rain. "If you leave, go somewhere else, somewhere they won't follow, you'll be safe." Others called for caution, warning of the dangers of trusting the unknown. As the argument raged on, Nyxera felt a familiar tug at the edges of her consciousness, the pull of the shadows, urging her to retreat, to vanish before the situation spiraled out of control. But then, amidst the chaos, a child stepped forward, a young girl no older than 10, her eyes wide with wonder. She held out a flower, its petals glistening with dew, and offered it to Nyxera. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice soft but sure. The gesture silenced the crowd, their gazes shifting from the girl to Nyxera and back again. Slowly, hesitantly, others began to step forward, offering tokens of gratitude, a handful of berries, a carved wooden whistle, a strand of braided grass. Each gift was small, insignificant on its own, but together they formed a bridge, a fragile, imperfect connection forged in the space between fear and understanding. Nyxera accepted them with trembling hands, her heart swelling with emotions she couldn't name. For the first time in centuries, she allowed herself to hope, not just for herself, but for the possibility of a world where differences didn't have to divide. Where love, however improbable, might find a way to endure. As the villagers dispersed, their torches fading into the distance, Elias turned to her, his eyes shining with unspoken emotion. "We did it," he murmured, reaching for her hand. "Together." She nodded, leaning into his touch as the first drops of rain began to fall, mingling with her tears. The journey ahead would be fraught with challenges, she knew that much. But for now, in this moment, surrounded by the remnants of trust and the promise of renewal, she dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had taken the first step toward something greater than either of them could have imagined alone. As the rain continued to fall, Nyxera and Elias stood together in the clearing, their hands intertwined, a symbol of unity between two worlds that had long been at odds. The villagers' acceptance was tentative, but it was a beginning, a fragile thread of hope woven into the fabric of their shared future. Nyxera realized then that love wasn't about erasing differences. It was about finding strength in them, about building bridges where none seemed possible. Though challenges lay ahead, she no longer faced them alone. For the first time, she understood that her purpose wasn't just to protect the forest. It was to inspire change, to remind both humans and herself that coexistence was within reach. As the storm passed and the stars re-emerged, casting their gentle light over the land, she felt a peace she hadn't known in centuries. Elias squeezed her hand, his presence a quiet promise that they would face whatever came next, together. And as the shadows danced around them, alive with her magic, Nyxera allowed herself to dream of a world where fear no longer ruled, where trust could grow like the trees she cherished. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she believed it was possible. Under the vast, endless sky, they took a step forward, not as enemies or strangers, but as partners in a story still being written.